And when we talk about privatization, and this is maybe moving a little bit more into the strategic area and an area that I find, frankly, fun. Fun, because privatization is fun. Is identifying those people who benefit and looking at the misbehavior and the corruption and the creation of oligarchs, which is always the sideshow to privatization. There are characters out there that you couldn't write if you were a Hollywood writer writing a black comedy about privatization. We need to name them. We need to talk about them. We need to connect the dots for people. Privatization has created some of the wealthiest and most powerful people on earth, many of them unapologetic criminals who flaunt their impunity and wave it in the face of this society. There was a piece by Martin Wolf in the Financial Times last year. Martin Wolf, John Ibbotson, birds of a feather. He's like their globalization guy. I think he'd be very comfortable at the Chicago School of Economics. He's a guardian of the status quo. And even he discovered that as many as 14 of the world's richest 100 people are Russians. Next to the United States, the single largest country group on the richest 100 list. Those 14 Russians have wealth equivalent to 26% of their country's GDP. And they got almost as much oil as Alberta in Russia. I mean, it's not a poor place. So how did they make their money? Martin Wolf concluded that they appropriated much of the wealth of a collapsing superpower. In other words, the oligarchs in Russia built their fortunes on privatizations that were slam-bam corruption fiestas. And they just snatched the public wealth of the country. And they are now 14 of the 100 richest people on earth. There's a guy named Carlos Slim. You've never heard of him? Last year he was richer than Gates. You've never heard of him. He was the richest man in the world last year. He's fallen to number 2 this year. He's Mexican. Through his political connections, he grabbed Telmex, the public telephone utility in Mexico, in 1990. Telmex, a generation later, still controls 92% of the landlines in Mexico. Mexico has some of the highest phone rates in the OECD. It's murderous getting a phone line in Mexico, and it's terribly expensive. And Carlos's wealth is estimated at some $59 billion, equal in that one man's holdings to 6.6% of Mexico's GDP. Now, Martin Wolf, bless him, and it's probably the only time that I will do so publicly, did a little calculation. And this is the kind of argument about privatization that I think really resonates with people. If Carlos Slim just banked his wealth and made 6% a year on it, when you got 59 bill, getting 6% a year return is not rocket science. You just park it somewhere. If he made 6% a year, his guaranteed annual income for the rest of time would be $3.6 billion, which is as much as the 3 million poorest Mexican citizens combined. Even Martin Wolf says, and I love his honesty, quote, "I am no egalitarian, but this surely needs some justification." When folks like these are starting to notice the effects of privatization and the way it works in our society, where are we? We've got to be naming and shaming this stuff too. And it's not just countries in the global south. Very briefly, another extraordinary privatization scandal, a company called Kinetic, spelled with Q's, this kind of oat branding approach to privatizing. In the UK, they took their Defense Evaluation and Research Agency, you know, because Q from James Bond, the like special tricks department of the Defense Department. They privatized it 2 years ago. Now Kinetic makes, I'm getting this from an article that I read in the Financial Times as well, I think, equipment for scanning buses for illegal immigrants. I'm not even sure how that works. Sweeping runways for dangerous pieces of metal. It makes the Talon bomb disposal robots that are in demand for the US Army in Iraq. It's the preferred bidder on the first stage of the Ministry of Defense in the UK's Defense Training Rationalization Program, which is the program to downsize the defense training facilities, i.e. a privatized outsourced company manages the outsourcing of other outsourced companies. And when Kinetic was privatized 2 years ago, this is 2 years ago in the United Kingdom, a small handful of top civil service bureaucrats made £100 million when they launched in one day, when they launched its IPO. They pumped up the dividends to themselves. They laid off hundreds of workers. So we have to talk about corruption and the creation of oligarchs and cartels, because they are the ones who are ruling on the frontiers of privatization. And I want to move into that now. Some of the frontiers of privatization. Now, I was on the CBC call-in show this afternoon at midday, and I was grateful to a caller for naming and shaming me for lifting unapologetically so many of my arguments from a book called The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism, written by a staggeringly intelligent and beautiful woman named Naomi Klein, whom I've known for some time. And it is with apologies to Naomi that I want to just reiterate some of the groundbreaking research that she's done, framed in my own way, of course, about the frontiers of privatization. Obviously, war is the biggest frontier in the history of privatization, and we are living in an historic period. We have to draw a line between daycare in Alberta and the logic that outsources war in America. It's the same logic, it's the same arguments, it's the same crap. Now, the cost of lives may be higher in privatizing war, but the misappropriation of public funds and the shift in resources in society away from governments and to powerful and destructive interests is the same. And these are powerful connections that resonate with people. The United States spends more on war than the rest of the world combined. In the last 20 years, that project of war has become largely privatized. It's one of the biggest transfers of public wealth to private hands in human history. In the Bush era alone, the last 7.5 years, the contractor economy, the contracted out economy in America has doubled from $200 billion a year to $400 billion a year in just one administration's rule. In 2003, 40% of every discretionary dollar that the Bush administration spent was spent on contractors. In the military realm, contractors deliver health care for soldiers. They now deliver housing for soldiers and their families. They do the dishes, and they build the bases, and they truck the fuel. You know, the apotheosis of this privatized vision of warfare is, of course, the Green Zone in Iraq, where you have Halliburton basically doing everything. Water, electricity. It's the only place that works in Iraq, to the extent that it works. And every conceivable service in this privatized bubble is provided by Halliburton and profited on by Halliburton. The Green Zone is really a Halliburton city-state, not an American outpost. And then over the war years, if you're paying attention, you can add wiretapping to the list of privatized services. Surveillance, telecom companies complicit in the warrantless wiretapping of millions of citizens, and lots of us too, because a lot of it is about foreign calls, right? Well, me anyway, and well, Bill and Larry, Diana for sure. And then you've got torture for profit in the United States, which is a pretty grisly fact. But if we want to talk about privatization, let's remember that in Abu Ghraib, part of the completely unregulated atmosphere there was the fact that contractors with very little training from firms like Khaki and Titan, big defense contractors, were doing intelligence work, i.e. torture. So torture for profit is part of the privatization picture. There's a wonderful anti-privatization activist in the United States named Charlie Cray, and he loves to say that the United States is a country where corporations write the president's daily security briefing. That's true. Conduct government security clearance background checks, process freedom of information requests, are increasingly taking on law enforcement duties, from criminal profiling to the management of private prisons. We know, of course, from the latest little scandal in the United States election cycle that private contractors also process passports. And if they happen to be checking up on the presidential candidates, well, they're not government employees with training in that field of discretion, security, and privacy. They're private contractors. Even the New York Times, and this is my night for ironically citing right-wing sources, said in an editorial last year that without a public debate or formal policy decision, contractors have become a virtual fourth branch of government in the United States.